Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the sanctions that are being applied against Russia because Donald Trump has now reduced the timeline that he's issued to President Putin in terms of showing some actual movement towards ending the war in Ukraine. So first of all, let's have a look at what Donald Trump said on July the 14th.
You're very unhappy I am with Russia, but we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means. I use trade for a lot of things, but it's great for settling wars. It's a horrible war, and it should be stopped. And so if it's not done, if we don't have an agreement in 50 days, that's what we're doing, secondary tariffs. And they're biting. And I hope we don't get to the point where we do, but I've been hearing so much talk. It's all talk. It's all talk, and then missiles go into Kiev.
So just to remind you, before Donald Trump took over as the president, he was saying that he was hoping to get the war in Ukraine finished in one day. But obviously, President Putin of Russia hasn't really been on board for that. And there have been repeated requests from Donald Trump to Putin asking him to come around the table, to agree some sort of peace settlement, to have a ceasefire, and all of those requests have been ignored. So on the 14th of July, Donald Trump issued this 50-day warning to Russia, basically saying that if a deal wasn't in place by then the sanctions were going to be ramped up. And you heard Donald Trump saying the secondary sanctions. So what he's talking about there is applying a 100% sanction on any country that continues doing trade with Russia after this 50-day deadline. So basically, that would mean that India and China, if they were continuing buying oil and gas and coal and all of the other things that they're buying directly from Russia, if they continue that relationship, then all of the exports that they're sending to the USA would be hit with a 100% tariff. So basically, that would double the price of all of those goods when they're going into the USA. And obviously, that would have a hugely negative impact on the amount of trade, the amount of volume, the amount of profit that all of those companies are making. And the problem, obviously, from India and China's point of view, is that the USA represents their biggest single export market. So this is actually a really big threat to those trade levels, because previously the West has been trying to penalize Russia, and the policing of that is quite difficult. So we've talked previously about the price cap that was introduced by the West, this $60 price cap on Russian oil. The problem with that is that firstly, the oil has to be moved on ships that are controlled by the West, either owned by them or insured by them. So if it isn't, then it's really difficult to be able to police it, because you'd have to stop the ship and then request the papers and see how much the oil had been agreed to be sold for, and then take some action, which is obviously relatively aggressive behavior. You're actually stopping potentially Russian vessels and demanding to see all of their paperwork. So it's difficult from a policing point of view. And there's been lots of loopholes that Russia has managed to find to continue doing that trade, doing ship-to-ship transfers and masking the ownership of the ships, and then also reducing the amount that they're selling the oil for and increasing the transport costs, all the little ways of getting around those rules. But what Donald Trump is proposing here is actually saying, we don't care what's happening on that side of things. If we see that Russia is still selling all of these products to India and China, then basically there will be a carte blanche 100% tariff applied against all of the imports into the USA. And as we've seen recently in the tariff negotiations, everybody is very worried about losing access to the US market. So I think this is quite a good threat against India and China and all of the secondary countries. Whether or not Russia sees it as a big risk, we have to wait and see. However, Donald Trump has now decided that the original 50-day deadline, which was due to expire on the 2nd of September, actually is too late, and he's now brought it forward.
President Donald Trump on Monday said he decided to give Vladimir Putin a shorter deadline to show Moscow was making an effort toward ending Russia's war in Ukraine.
What is your new deadline? What
I'm going to make a new deadline of about 10 or 12 days from today. No reason in waiting. there's no reason in waiting. It's 50 days. I want to be generous, but we just don't see any progress being made.
Trump's remarks come as he met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Scotland. He said he was disappointed in Putin's continued aggression against Kyiv.
We thought we had that settled numerous times, and then President Putin goes out and starts launching rockets into some city like Kiev and kills a lot of people in a nursing home or whatever. You have bodies lying all over the street. And I say that's not the way to do it.
So what we're hearing there from Donald Trump is that he's now losing patience with Vladimir Putin, and he's reduced this deadline from the original 50 days to 10 or 12 days. And in terms of what that means from today, it means that we're looking at a deadline now of between the 7th or the 9th of August, depending on whether it's 10 or 12 days. So that is pretty soon. So Russia is going to have to show some meaningful efforts that it's wanting a peace settlement before then. Otherwise, these new sanctions will be put into place. Now, before we go into the details of what that means, I just wanted to ask if you could subscribe, please, because my subscriber numbers aren't really moving very rapidly. And I know that more than 50% of people who are watching these videos are not subscribers. And I don't know whether that means that you can't be bothered or you just haven't got round to it, but it doesn't cost anything. Subscriber, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. YouTube puts it on there saying, oh, we've got so many subscribers. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. But what it shows is support for me and the channel. And I think it's interesting at the moment because if you've been following my channel, you'll know that over the past 3 or 4 years, the content has changed a little bit. At the start of the Ukraine war, I was posting a lot of videos on Russia, probably 4 or 5 a week. I've reduced the amount of that because this channel is predominantly looking at economics. I'm talking about what the impact on the global economy is and what's going on in various other economies. So I've taken a deliberate step to not post as many videos about Russia because it was getting caught up, I think, in all of the other war vlogging videos. So when I see who else my audience is watching, it tends to be lots of video channels where they're basically looking at the war and the military efforts and bombing and this and that. That isn't what I was trying to achieve. So I think what's happened with my subscribers over the past year or so, as I've been moving away from posting a lot on Russia, is that people who just want to hear about Russia are unsubscribing, and I'm attracting new people who want to hear about economics and what's going on in various economies. So if you're one of those new people, can you please hit the subscriber button so I can see my subscriber numbers going up, because I'm sort of treading water at the moment, which is a little bit demoralizing. But anyway, thank you if you have just hit that subscriber button. Now, in terms of the 100% tariff that we've just talked about, obviously doubling the price of everything going into the USA would have a massive impact. However, there's actually a proposal on the table in the USA at the moment to increase that to 500%. So basically increasing the cost of any imports from any country that continues dealing with Russia by 5 times. Now, this is a bipartisan bill that was introduced in April 2025 by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, and it proposes this 500% basically wipeout, so nobody's going to continue buying any products from any country if it's suddenly 5 times more expensive. And the countries that are really being targeted here are India, China, Turkey, and Brazil, who would basically see all of their exports to the USA stopping overnight. And the logic behind that, why the USA is threatening to do it, is because they want those countries to make a choice between whether or not they want to continue dealing with Russia or whether they want to continue dealing with the USA. And I can tell you that in terms of the importance of both countries, the USA is significantly more important than Russia. The USA represents a huge export market for all of those countries, China and India particularly. It's their biggest single export markets. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Russia just simply isn't as big in terms of population, only has a population of around 145 million compared with 350 million in the USA. But also economically, the US market is the biggest in the world. It's the biggest economy. Russia isn't even in the top 10. So if you are having to choose between, do I want to continue selling things to the USA or do I want to continue buying things from Russia, Well, you can buy all of those things from somebody else. You can get oil and gas and coal from elsewhere. So this is a genuine, real threat to the Russian economy, because if they lost India and China as export markets, then the fossil fuel industry in Russia would collapse. It would be on its knees, because the only reason why Russia has managed to continue over the last 3 years is that it managed to switch a lot of its sales that it was previously making into Europe, its closest neighbor geographically, to China and India. And even though there have been sanctions put into place and price caps, they were still able to move large volumes. But if this new tariff system does come into place, it will have quite a big impact on the global economy. So we're talking about potentially up to $1.3 trillion worth of trade could be affected. So these are imports into the USA. So all of those countries are selling collectively 1.3 trillion every single year. So if they were to lose that, that would obviously be massively damaging to their GDP and their economy. So that's less likely. But it will actually cause potential global inflation, because if we do see Russia taken out of the global energy supply market because nobody is allowed to deal with them, then that will reduce the supply at the same time as demand stays the same. And simple economics tells us that if we have a reduction in supply and demand is equal, then that will push the price up. So energy products would become more expensive, which potentially would be a good thing for any country that has lots of energy products, such as the USA. So interestingly, this could actually work out better for the US. Could be worse for consumers, because prices and inflation would be going up. But if you're in the oil industry or the gas industry, then that could actually represent a good opportunity. It also could put a lot of diplomatic strain onto the relations between the US with India, China, Brazil, and Turkey, and many other countries. But I don't think that's going to be a problem from Donald Trump's point of view, because he's already at that point. He's been dealing with everybody about the tariffs anyway. And basically, he's laying out the law saying, if this happens, then you can't deal with Russia anymore. And if you want to, then you're not going to be able to have access to the US market. The estimate in terms of how much this could push up the price of oil is between $6 and $11 per barrel. And that is quite a big movement when you're talking about something that has a price of around $75, $80. If you're talking about a $10 movement, that's very significant. So this is all due to happen at the early part of August. So we're not that far away from seeing whether or not this does come into effect. Now, in terms of what has Russia's reaction to this been, what has Russia said? Well, the official line from Russia that's been posted by the Kremlin says that they've noted the comments, but that the special military operation in Ukraine will continue and it doesn't recognize external deadlines. So basically it's saying, we're not interested, we're not going to be bullied, we're going to carry on doing what we're doing. However, Dmitry Medvedev, who is currently the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, but was previously the president of Russia between 2008 and 2012. He's actually the only other person who's been the president of Russia in the last 20 years. And the reason why he was the president is because they have a rule in Russia about you can't have 3 consecutive terms as president. So he and Vladimir Putin switched roles between 2008 and 2012. Vladimir Putin became the prime minister and Medvedev became the president. But realistically, I think we all know who was still running the country at that point. But I thought it was worth having a quick look at his history. You can see that he's held some very senior positions. So 1990 to 2000, he was deputy chief of staff to President Putin. He then became first deputy chief of staff. He was the chairman of Gazprom, which is the Russian business that owns all of the gas, that previously was doing very well. Obviously not doing as well now. It's making huge losses as a result of losing Europe as a big customer. He was the chairman of that between 2002, 2008. Prime Minister from 05 to 08, then the president. Then he was the prime minister again between 12 and 20. And now he's the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council. And he was appointed after resigning as the prime minister. And this is a brand new role that was created for him. So he's quite vocal on social media. And he's responded to Donald Trump's statement. And what he said, and this is a translation because obviously it was in Russian when he posted it on X, he said, Trump is playing the ultimatum game with Russia. First 50 days, now 10. Russia isn't Israel or even Iran. And obviously that's a reference to the fact that the US was recently involved in the bombing raids on Iran when they took out the enrichment facilities. Each new ultimatum is a threat and a step towards war, not just with Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't go down the Sleepy Joe road. Now, that is an out and out reference to, firstly, a war between Russia and the USA. And then, secondly, he's having a dig at Joe Biden, because obviously Joe Biden was much more supportive of Ukraine. He was overtly on Ukraine's side. Donald Trump has been a little bit more diplomatic. He's been sitting in the middle up until recently, when he recently approved lots of military equipment to be sold to Ukraine, to NATO. So he's basically saying, don't be the same as Joe Biden. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is really quite interesting. When Donald Trump first took over as the president, it looked like there was a potential that the war in Ukraine could have been concluded in a relatively short space of time. That was obviously his objective when he took over. However, Vladimir Putin hasn't really played ball. He hasn't signed up to any of the things that Donald Trump has asked him to do. And over the past 6 months, we have seen a gradual breakdown in the relationship between the two. They've had these 2 long phone calls where it looked like some progress was being made. However, as Donald Trump alluded to earlier in the video, he's hearing a lot of talk from Russia, but not a lot of action. The war is continuing, the bombing raids are continuing to ramp up, and I think Donald Trump has now realized that President Putin doesn't look like he's going to come around the table and agree any sort of peace deal anytime soon. So he issued an ultimatum on the 14th of July, giving 50 days to Russia to come up with some sort of deal. However, he's now shortened that, and I think the reason he's done that is because the reality of the situation is that Russia isn't really moving anywhere near a peace settlement. So what we are likely to see at the middle of August is the introduction of these new range of tariffs. And the tariffs that are being talked about are actually extremely penal, because rather than going after Russia, rather than trying to put tariffs onto Russian deals and then trying to police those, which is very difficult to do, he's now targeting their biggest trade partners. So he's saying, we don't really care what Russia's doing. We're more interested in what you're doing, India and China and Turkey and Brazil and lots of other nations. And if you continue to buy things from Russia after the deadline that we set, then we are going to hurt your exports to the USA, because Donald Trump is totally in control of what's coming in through the US borders. So he doesn't have to worry about tracking Russian vessels and worrying about what deals have been agreed and how much oil is being sold for. All he needs to do is see that any oil or any gas or any coal or anything at all is being sold by Russia to any of those nations, and he can then say, okay, your exports to the USA are now going to drop dramatically, because he's said that he's going to apply a 100% tariff. That could potentially be as high as 500%. There is a bill going through that will be sped up if this all does happen. That could increase those prices by 5 times. And if that was to happen, that would completely decimate all of the trade. We recently saw the reaction to all of the countries in the world when Donald Trump was threatening 15, 30, 50% tariffs on lots of different nations. There was a scramble to try to avoid those. So obviously 100% or 500% would be completely devastating for that business. And as we've talked about in today's video, the USA is the biggest economy in the world. It's the biggest single export market for most countries, and so it's the most attractive market to go after. So if a country has to make a decision between losing its exports to the USA or not buying things from Russia, I think it's going to be relatively easy, because all of the things that Russia is selling are available elsewhere. You can buy oil and gas and all of those sort of things from other suppliers. So Russia, if it was to lose that business, would be completely dead in the water, because the Russian economy is surviving because it's been able to continue selling large quantities of oil and gas to places like India and China. So if those markets were to close from Russia's point of view, it wouldn't have anywhere to go. And as we've talked about in previous videos, Russia doesn't have anywhere to store its oil. So if it loses its markets, it would have to close down its oil production, because it can't keep pulling the oil out of the ground. It doesn't have anything to do with it. It's the same as the gas. Since losing the deals with the European Union, the gas is remaining under the ground. It's just sitting there dormant, not being monetized, not feeding the Russian economy. And that could happen with oil. And as we've talked about previously, the problem with oil production is you can't just switch it on and off. You have to have a constant flow. If you now have to start thinking about reducing the amount that you're pulling out, that could have major problems going forward in terms of just making those oil wells unmanageable, very difficult to use. So this represents a really serious threat from Russia's point of view, and it will be really interesting to see what happens over the course of the next week or so, because that deadline is now counting down. We're going to get to the 9th or the 10th or the 11th of August, and the deadline will be here. And then if Russia hasn't agreed some sort of peace settlement, it will then be upon the US authorities and Donald Trump to follow through on this threat, to actually impose this 100% sanction. And if that happens, it's going to cause chaos in the global markets, because if China and India lose those export markets, then that's going to cause major problems for all of their businesses. And as we know, China is already struggling anyway in terms of its own economy. Lots of companies are making losses. We've got deflation in the Chinese home market, so it needs its biggest export market to keep going. So realistically, India and China aren't going to run that risk of losing the market. They're more likely to put a stop to buying things from Russia, which could cause a collapse in Russia within a very short space of time. So it's going to be a fascinating couple of weeks. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. As I said earlier, I'm looking to increase the subscriber numbers. They're not really going anywhere at the moment, so it'd be nice to get closer to 500,000. Thank you to everyone that's supporting me also. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, I really appreciate that act of generosity. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership, where you can watch all my videos promotion free, you can watch on Patreon advert free, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.
Ça s'est terminé.